Once again, we welcome you to Moving Forward with Young Voices. We are happy to welcome Sam Raus back to the program. Sam is a Young Voices contributor and wears a few other hats as well. In fact, Sam, before we dive into our topic for the day, let's first of all have a little bit of background about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, so I am a Tech and Consumer Freedom Fellow currently with Young Voices, and I've been writing with them for over a year now. But I'm particularly diving in now to a lot of issues regarding tech, particularly the advent of AI that we are currently living through, and a number of different regulatory and consumer finance related issues that are touching everyone's lives across the country and different state level policies and national policies. And I've been particularly honing in on the excess of regulation that came out of the Biden administration and what is going to come of that in the coming months and years with the new White House.
You know, I feel sometimes like I'm trying to wade through a very fast-flowing stream in that I'm aware of AI. I actually use it a little bit, but I haven't committed to fully diving in, you know, and going with it. But it's pulling me along. I mean, I just updated my software on my computer. I updated my phone. Both are now offering AI features that they didn't before. So it's here. And as you make the point in your article published in Newsweek, you know, it is found in virtually every part of our culture, our society, our economy. So let's talk about why is it so heavily regulated, and what's the source of that regulation? Why are there so many people who want to put those controls on it?
Well, I think in a big picture sense, when you think of maybe an everyday person, a regular voter's concerns, is there's always this quick hesitation and fear when it comes to new technologies that may drastically alter and change everyday life. I mean, I think people have very legitimate and lasting fears about the impact of what this means for their jobs and whether or not this could lead to job displacement, changes in different industries. Certainly, there's a lot of fears about what could be an AI that controls itself, and I think we're still well off that. But there's certainly questions about autonomy and whether or not how much things are being controlled still by humans. But when you actually look into the lobbying behind these laws that have come into place and some of the executive orders that were initially put in by the Biden administration, what we've seen is the very major tech companies, and this being some of the legacy ones, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, but even OpenAI, which is Sam Altman's, the ChatGPT, the biggest AI company in the world right now, have been supporting these laws, using the guise of a lot of these fears about AI safety risks, about mitigating, the harms of their own technology. But what it really shows is there is a clear sign of attempted regulatory capture early on in this industry. And what is happening is, by and large, the laws being proposed have less and less to do with harmful uses of AI and how AI is integrated into different things and protecting maybe some labor concerns, and much, much more so with regards to computing power and the disclosure requirements. And it's operating much more like financial regulation, where it is setting in this high bar of you need to disclose this much information to the federal government. You need to meet these different compliance standards of the federal government, in which we all know from the financial industry is that by and large harms small businesses and startups because they simply cannot afford to compete and entrenches the big special interests. And, I think this is a hard thing to talk about because people are quick to rush to judgment of these companies. And I think it's much more important that we talk about the structures of the laws than maybe particular actors or lobbyists. But it still stands that what we're seeing is by and large a regulatory capture issue.
You mentioned in your article that one of the reasons a lot of people have been calling for more or tighter government control is because of the spread of misinformation. And I'm just curious, what are some of the rumors about, the dangers that would require government to keep a much greater control over AI. What do people say, either is happening or is going to happen that turns out is actually misinformation?
Yeah, so I think what people see as misinformation, and I use that word very sparingly, but is that AI in its earliest form, which every day we are getting better and better AI because it learns from itself, it learns from being used, is now at the beginning of it with the limited information and verification services that it has, you will ask it questions, whether it's about factual things, asking, what's the capital of a country, or mathematical questions, asking it to calculate something for you. And sometimes it gives the wrong answer. And so there's very serious concerns that, people may be asking AI questions about political news or their health or foreign conflicts, and that it might give inaccurate information on those much more serious questions, maybe than financial questions or questions about, capitals. And so people are quick to jump to the conclusion that this means that AI will exacerbate this problem and cause for more spread of inaccurate claims and information. But what we're seeing is, one, AI is improving. And the first ChatGPT was relatively terrible at math, and now it's pretty good. I've come to use it for charting out different things for my personal finances, but also that it is it's really getting its footing and being able to actually act much more as a fact checker itself. And I believe that Twitter has been using, X has been using AI in order to run its community notes with still some human interaction with that. But this trend of trying to do this big top-down government control of misinformation is obviously following quickly by the wayside as both X and Facebook have completely switched to a more interactive and multi-tiered system. But I think that there's still going to be a lot of lingering concerns in the coming years, especially how much this discussion about misinformation gets politicized and gets separated into different political bubbles, as opposed to, talking about the systems and the way in which we're considering these things.
Sam, you point out in the final days of the lame duck part of the Biden presidency, there's been a real push, to get as much of that regulation in place as possible. Would the Republicans, when they're taking control of both the White House and both houses of Congress, are they likely to govern differently? Are they also, wanting to have more control over AI, or is there a clear difference between the two camps?
Well, very thankfully, this lame duck bill that I was speaking out against in the piece did not come into fruition, and now we've inaugurated the new Senate. We're inaugurating the new president next week. I don't think that regulatory structure is going to remain in place. I would suspect the Safety Institute will be dismantled rather quickly. And based off the signs of the incoming president's AI advisors, I think there's going to be much less of a regulatory push in the coming years, and I think it'll be much more focused on specific concerns with regards to deep fakes, maybe with regards to specific examples of information, perhaps regarding Israel or Ukraine. But I think we'll be much more likely to see a light touch from the incoming president.
Okay. And I love that you point out, if they want to see a real world example of what happens when there is overregulation, just look at the European Union and what it's done to their tech sector.
Yeah, I always think we need to look more towards the example of what's happening in the European Union, what happened to nuclear energy in the United States, and especially because of how closely tied those two issues are to our domestic AI. I mean, those are very clearly linked to this, but it remains to be seen what will come in the coming year, and hopefully we'll see a bit more of a shift towards freedom.
All right. Once again, we are talking with Sam Raus. He is a recent graduate of University of Miami. He's a writer with Young Voices. Sam, where can people find you on social media?
Yeah, you can find me at Sam Raus 1 on X, and check out more with Young Voices in my number of pieces.
All right. Thank you very much. And we are back on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Happy to welcome Ethan Brown back to the program. Ethan, you are a veteran. You've been on here many times, but for the sake of people who are meeting you for the first time, take a moment and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. Great to be back on the show. I am Ethan Brown. I am the resident climate person at Young Voices. My past experience, I got a BA in Environmental Analysis and Policy at Boston University. I hosted the Sweaty Penguin podcast for 4 years through PBS's Climate Initiative. And currently I'm working at Metcalf Institute at the University of Rhode Island, which works to connect journalists and climate scientists. So really excited about that new position.
Well, there's no shortage of climate-related stuff to discuss these days. I mean, the fires in Los Angeles. I know that people are connecting that to climate, to the recent Polar Express and so forth. But you have an article here in nationalinterest.org about the U.S. taking heat for its ICJ climate stance. But you say it was right to take that heat. Walk us through this. First of all, for those who don't know, what is the ICJ?
The ICJ is the International Court of Justice in The Hague. It's one of several international organizations that many countries abide by their leadership, and this one in particular is a forum for countries to, I guess you could say, sue other countries when they have some sort of dispute. So there's the International Criminal Court, which might issue arrests or that sort of thing. The International Court of Justice, I guess, would be more the civil court. So, and the other thing that they do, which is applicable to this case, is they'll issue advisory opinions where if there is sort of a dispute brewing and countries just want to say, hey, what is the international law here? They offer that clarification.
Okay. So talk to me about the U.S. taking heat for its stance regarding the International Court of Justice. First of all, what was the case or the controversy in which the U.S. Stepped in and made a stand?
So this was pretty historic for folks who nerd out about this stuff, but it's a big deal. There's Vanuatu, which is a small Pacific island, brought a case to the ICJ, which was co-sponsored by several other countries, that was asking for an advisory opinion around international climate law. And what they were asking, this was the first time that climate change has been brought to The Hague. And what they were asking is whether climate law is just under existing climate treaties, with the Paris Agreement being the most prominent one, or if other human rights laws would apply to climate, given that climate change does create human rights problems. There's the climate justice issue, where countries that emitted the most carbon are often different than the countries having the most impact from climate change. Vanuatu, of course, is not a high carbon emitter, and they're literally drowning due to climate change. So it's an interesting case. It's an important case. What the U.S. basically said, and I think over 100 countries submitted arguments, but the U.S. was arguing that climate should stay under the Paris Agreement and the existing climate treaties. And a lot of activists said this was disheartening, this was morally bankrupt, and I think I understand if you're looking plainly from a justice point of view that, yes, there is a human rights violation and you want to see justice for a country like Vanuatu. What it misses, though, is the Paris Agreement has actually been quite effective, and we can get into that more, but I think a big part of why it's been effective is that countries have been cooperating with each other and working together, and if you start to drive wedges between countries with a case like this, I worry that it could make some of that fall apart.
You mentioned in your article that the Paris Agreement may not be perfect. In fact, you say it's far from perfect, but it's working. What are some of the places where it could be better?
Yeah, so first I'll say what is working. I think that before the Paris Agreement was signed, the world was on track to warm by 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, which would be catastrophic. Today, a decade later, the world is on track to warm by 2.7 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, which is an improvement. It's not enough to avert disasters. Obviously, we're seeing right now with the LA wildfires and everything how even 1.5 degrees of warming creates a lot of disasters. But 2.7 is a big improvement, and the Paris Agreement helped facilitate some of that progress. What's not working, I think people come at it from two different angles. And I was kind of surprised to see that there's this kind of far right and far left resistance to the Paris Agreement. I think the argument from the right would be more that the US has done more of a share than a country like China or India. What I would say to that, China's emissions just fell for the first time in 2024. I think every country is at their own pace, and the Paris Agreement is kind of a way to just keep the thing moving in the right direction. If we're not working together, then it's I just don't see a point in that. The argument from the far left, it seems, is that the Paris Agreement has no enforcement mechanism, which means we can't force countries to do anything. We can't blame everything on America. And I think that, again, it's international law is effective to the degree to which the countries participating buy into it and support it. And so the more you throw in sticks, the more countries might disengage.
What about nations like India? And I'm just what I'm wondering specifically is whether population density plays into those emissions.
It does to an extent. India is an interesting case because a few years ago at the UN Climate Conference, India took a lot of heat for refusing to sign an agreement that specifically used the word coal and a phase out of coal. And China also refused, but India really took a lot of the blame. And what I said at the time was the Western world is very reliant on oil and gas. That's where a lot of our emissions are coming from. India is very reliant on coal. And so to force them to sign an agreement that just said coal was a little bit unfair. And so my point was if we could have an agreement that talks about what a transition away from fossil fuels looks like, then maybe India would be more on board. And obviously that's not something that happens tomorrow. That's a long drawn out process, but talking about what that looks like. The following year, India proposed at the UN Climate Conference that we have an agreement that talks about a phase out of fossil fuels. And so I was a little proud of myself for being right about that, but I think that goes to show that India is willing to engage, but we have to meet them where we're at. We have to understand they are still a developing country, but they're also a very climate vulnerable country. And so I think they understand where this needs to go, and it's just gonna, again, it takes working together. We can't all do this by ourselves.
And as far as, getting away from fossil fuels, I know I hear the term renewable energy, and that could probably encompass a lot of different options. What is the most viable path forward if we are stepping away from those fossil fuels?
It's a process. It doesn't happen overnight, like I said, but I think what's really encouraging is in the last decade, the cost of solar dropped by 85%, the cost of onshore wind dropped by 55%, the cost of batteries for electric vehicles dropped by 85%. It's now at the point where I forget which year, but in a recent year, there was a study that found 62% of new renewables that came onto the grid were cheaper than the cheapest fossil fuel alternative. And that's really where we need to be. It needs to be economically competitive. It also obviously has to be viable in the context of not being overly weather dependent or that sort of thing. But if you do a combination of things, if you have solar, you have wind, you have nuclear, you have all these different energy sources, you can make a grid that works and a grid that's economically viable.
Okay, I'm going to be keeping an eye on Vanuatu, and it wasn't on my radar screen before, but thanks to you, Ethan, it now is. We're talking with Ethan Brown. He is an award-winning climate journalist and also a contributor for Young Voices. Ethan, where can people follow you on social media?
You can find me at Ethan Brown 5151 wherever you want to go. You can also check out thesweatypenguin.com. There are no more podcasts, but we are doing new journalism and other news content, so go check that out.
And we are back on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Hey, we're happy to welcome a new contributor to the program. His name is Ian Golan. He is actually checking in from Finland today. That's a first for us. Ian, so good to have you on the program. For those who are meeting you for the very first time, could you take a moment to tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Hello, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Ian Golan. I'm an executive publisher of a European libertarian magazine, Speak Freely, and I also am a fellow with Young Voices Europe. So I specialize in the area of conscription. So I'm working currently on the topic of on a book on this very topic. So hopefully 2025 we'll see the book come to life.
Yeah, I'm looking at an article that you wrote for moderndiplomacy.eu. Finland's equal opportunity military conscription is not a win for young people or Europe's defense. And when I think of military conscription, I think specifically of seeing news footage of teams in Ukraine, gathering young men and even not so young men and conscripting them into their military forces. What is the situation in Europe and specifically in Finland, where it's being called equal opportunity conscription? Is this a standard feature in each of these societies?
Oh yeah, it has been getting much worse. So the panic about Putin invasion from Russia is at its highest possible, and people are very pro conscription. So the Baltics recently have brought back conscription. Sweden brought back conscription. Serbia is considering having conscription. There are all those countries where we have basically reverted on the progress that has been made in the last 50 years. In this area, and now Finland, which have had conscription since the very beginning of the country, has this brilliant idea of bringing in women to the conscription. So both genders will be imprisoned in the military under this new policy.
Let's first talk about some of the reasons why conscription is not a good thing. Would you mind making the case for us why there are better ways than conscripting people into military service?
So I think it comes down to self-selection. So basically, you want the people in the military who are willing to fight in the war that is coming. So in Ukraine, for instance, you see that millions of young people left Ukraine, and it is often the males who are supposed to be conscripted into the military. So if they would have gone through the conscription period, this would have been just a complete waste of resources on the training. On like every mortar round they fired would have been just a cost but has been lost and didn't help the national defense of Ukraine. So conscription is a very odd policy because it in a way it is built on this honor and tradition around military, but it is very disrespectful to the actual people who are serving in the military because it is basically a way to not pay them for what they do. It's basically a way to pay them close to unlivable wages. This is actually the only occasion where slave wages or unfair wages are actually applicable in the modern society. So on the labor market you get exactly the wages you deserve for the service you provide, but here the people are forced into service and they are not paid what they deserve at all.
When you use the word slave wages, I think that is accurate. And I know some people don't like the word slavery, but when an outside person or organization is claiming ownership over an individual and their physical body, that seems to fit pretty well with the definition of what slavery, or at least chattel slavery, consists of. It's someone else claiming ownership of another human being and forcing them to do things, whether they want to or not.
Yeah, and it's actually very tough for young people. So if someone has a child at the time they are going through conscription, suddenly they are left without any income in the family. For instance, there's a single mother who is left outside of on her own while the man is conscripted into the military. So you can look at it from a philosophical perspective where it's obviously slavery, it's immoral, it's unethical, but it's also touching the young people who often are reliant on their parents, and if they don't have good relationship with the parents, then they are left struggling, and they are often unable to like keep their apartments during the conscription period because they are in Finland, for instance, they are paid less than actual prisoners working in prisons. So this is like an absurd situation where young people are struggling, but we have conscription, we are safe.
How long is a typical term for which a young man would be conscripted?
So usually it's half a year, but this can be extended to even a year in Finland. So that's a very long period. And if you do not want to go to the military, you are forced to do a civil service, which is 2 years. And then this is also like a complete waste of time. It's if you would imagine. So conscription is a tax in kind, which is one of the worst taxes you can possibly have. So if you need to build a road somewhere, you don't just go around. You don't just round up people on the street and force them to build the road. You find people who are best equipped to do this, who are best, who have the necessary skills, who have the time, who do not have any more important jobs to do this. And so conscription is just terrible economically, philosophically. I don't think you can defend this policy.
And as far as now bringing women into that conscription process, whose idea was that? Who came up with the idea of, this is so good, we should probably allow this same thing for women?
I think the blame is to be had at all, like on the entire political spectrum, because you have support for this policy from the left to the right, basically. I think it's a way to sort of virtue signal feminism in a way. So make conscription. So now women are included in conscription, and now we are all equal. But in fact, so Norway has the same policy. So women are included in conscription in Norway, and women still only make up 20 to 30% of the conscript forces. So this is just this is kind of a fiction, but virtue signals, but there's equality, while conscription is still a tax on men. So gender is the sole determinant why certain part of the population is has to spend a life, a 1 year of their life in misery of military barracks.
I like in your article where you say conscription is not a duty, it's an assault on the freedom of the young. And I agree with you on this. A government that is doing its job to protect the rights of its people and to make their society work, and to help things function smoothly, should not have a problem finding individuals who would be willing to step up to defend it. But when they cross that line into forcibly bringing people into military service, it seems like the relationship between the citizen and the state is turned upside down.
Yeah, it's sort of funny because there's this idea of like obligation to serve is brought up, and so this is usually paired with the idea that citizenship comes with obligations and freedoms, and you need some obligations. But then, if women are not part of those obligations, it's very odd, because then they are like a special case, but it's not required to serve the military despite having all the equal rights. So on this, this is like an absurd perspective on conscription, but falls apart on all sorts of ways. But from this perspective, it makes sense to conscript women. But I just believe that we should use any possible exemption to just exempt people from conscription. So there was this libertarian party in Georgia, which Georgia also had conscription. They came up with this wonderful idea of because in Georgia we used to have religious exemptions from conscription. So they actually set up their own church, and they had people join the church to escape conscription. And so I'm all for it. If there's a way to if there's any way to escape conscription for young people, we should open those gates, even if only one gender can escape conscription.
Again, we are talking with Ian Golan. Ian, wonderful to meet you. What a great topic, too. Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you.
And we are back. This is our fourth and final segment of Moving Forward with Young Voices today. Happy to welcome to the program Jasper Dietz. He is checking in from Lithuania. And Jasper, so good to have you on the show. This is your first time on Moving Forward with Young Voices. Take a moment to tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Brian, first of all. My name is Jasper Dietz, 26, from the Netherlands originally. I lived in Lithuania for 2 years, where I did my master's in Eastern European and Russia studies. Currently a fellow with Young Voices Europe, specializing in Eastern European affairs. And starting March this year, I'll be a trainee at the NATO headquarters in Brussels. So looking forward to that as well.
Wow. Well, I guess this fits well with the topic we'll be discussing. I'm looking at an article that you've written for neweasterneurope.eu. EU fiscal rules are slowing down Lithuania funding its defenses against Russia. Now, we hear a lot about Russia and Ukraine, but there are a lot of other, particularly Eastern European and Central European nations that also are very concerned with what's going on there. Talk to me a little bit about Lithuania and its relationship with Russia. Are the two countries, are they at odds with one another?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Lithuania and the Baltic states at large, with Latvia and Estonia, they have a long past of struggle with Russia. They were under about a 200-year rule under the Russian Empire, and then of course the Soviet Union. So they know more than anyone else in Europe what it's like to be under Russian control. So they really resonate with the Ukrainians in that sense. And of course, because of that, they see the looming threat that is Russia still, that's on the horizon, and you know, they're bordering Belarus, and they're bordering the Kaliningrad exclave that belongs to Russia. So they're in quite a peculiar geographical position, you could say. Yeah.
So that puts some pressure on Lithuania to build up their national defense. Talk to me about what that would entail and why it would involve taking on some substantial loans.
Right. So currently, Lithuania is spending about 3.2% of their GDP on defense, which is actually really high compared to the rest of Europe. But they're quite a small nation, so absolutely, it still doesn't mean that they have a large army. However, they're trying to establish a military division by the end of this decade. But as it's currently looking, they won't be able to complete this plan by at least 2036 or maybe even 2040. So they want to drastically ramp up the defense spending to be able to get this military division set in place. But it requires them to go to about 5 to 5.5% of defense spending relative to their GDP. And this means that unfortunately they are likely to breach the EU fiscal rules that dictate that debt to GDP ratio should be less than 60% and deficit to GDP ratio 3%. No, please.
Those rules are they so rigid that they can't account for a pressing danger, for instance, and say, well, you are facing a clear threat from Russia, so therefore those rules should be relaxed. I mean, does it take a lot to work around those rules or to change them?
Unfortunately, Brian, the EU is known for its regulations and constraints at this moment, and financial constraints lie at the core of most of the defense-related challenges. So it's not as easily done as it is said. But there are possibilities to, for example, put an exemption in place for these fiscal rules for defense spending. Of course, you have to take into account that this doesn't set a parameter for other future challenges, if that makes sense. But that's why it's important to recognize the imminent threat that is Russia right now. And I think it would be a great idea to also incentivize countries to spend more on defense, because Lithuania is one of the countries that spends comparatively a lot, but other countries right now are lagging behind even the 2% rule that NATO dictates. So it could also provide an incentive for countries to actually start spending more on their defense and to facilitate the ones that are already doing it.
And I apologize for having to ask this, but I honestly don't know. Is Lithuania a member of NATO?
It is indeed, yes. Yeah, there's quite a few NATO troops stationed here as well. Some American troops, some Germans, some Dutch. And they're also looking to ramp up these numbers in the coming years, as recently came out that Russia could be ready to attack the Baltic states by the end of this decade. So all the signs are pointing towards increased defense expenditure. So we need to set in place the right fiscal things to facilitate this as well.
So, understanding that you have the European Union that they're working within, as well as NATO, who leads out when it comes to making the necessary preparations that Lithuania wants to make? In other words, who holds the ultimate decision-making power? Is it the EU?
Ultimately, Lithuania have said, we're going to do this regardless, even if it means breaching the fiscal rules. But in my opinion, it cannot be that a country that's on the front line of the EU, that's actively defending the EU and NATO against the Russian threat. That's the thin line between barbarism and civil society. It cannot be the case that we are going to punish these countries for actively contributing to the defense of the entire Union.
So I'm curious, if Lithuania does go ahead and violate those rules, does this mean that they are then going to be sanctioned by the European Union? In other words, what can the European Union do other than write them a stern letter? Or
yeah, that's the thing with the EU as well, of course, when it comes to matters like these. What they're actually going to do, whether they're going to actively sanction Lithuania in this case, it's unlikely. As of now, there are also a few countries that are already breaching these fiscal rules. France, for example, one of the biggest countries in the Union, that are breaching the rules by quite a bit, and that have not yet been sanctioned. So in that case, it's in that regard, it's perhaps more of a matter of what's it called? Sorry, I lost the words. English is not my first language, of course.
Let me ask you this: Will there come a point where the Russian threat will have been seen to be abated? What would it take for these nations of Europe to feel free from the threat of Russia encroaching on them?
Well, from the Lithuanian perspective, or the Baltic perspective at large, Russian defeat is the only way to keep them from remaining a threat to them. That's why they're so adamant on maintaining support for Ukraine, and that's why it's so frustrating for them to see that so far they've not been provided the means to actually defeat Russia, but only just about to keep them on their feet. So for them, defeat of Russia is the only thing that could stop this threat. But whether that's realistic, that's another question, of course.
As much as I would love to say, well, gee, it just looks like there's this clear path forward, that doesn't appear to be the case. But because it's not going to be Lithuania by themselves or any of these other European nations by themselves, is it basically, where are they going to find their common ground? Is it within NATO as opposed to the European Union? Is that where they're most likely to look for leadership to meet that threat?
Yeah, most likely. That's why it's so important to ramp up defense expenditure, to show the US and show the Trump administration, look, this is what we're all doing to contribute to this, to make this alliance work. And that will hopefully also mean that Trump would be less likely to withdraw aid or withdraw from NATO altogether. So yeah, ramping up defense spending is the way to go in the next few years, for sure.
Again, we are talking with Jasper Dietz. He's a policy fellow with Young Voices and also a Vilnius University graduate specializing in Eastern European and Russian affairs. Where can people find you on social media?
Mostly on LinkedIn. That's where I post all of my articles and my updates. It's Jasper Dietz, D-I-E.